Maple Street had a stillness that seemed to belong to another century. The elm trees bent inward like guardians, their leaves whispering secrets down the narrow road. Crickets sang in the ditches, and the faint smell of rain clung to the wood porches long after sunset. At number 14, a single lamp still glowed in the front window, a steady square of amber light that spilled across the cracked pavement and the trimmed hedge. It burned every night faithfully, as if to tell the town that the Ellisons were home and all was well in their small corner of the world. Inside, Tommy Ellison, 9 years old, sat cross-legged on the living room rug. He arranged his toy soldiers into neat rows between the legs of his father's chair, their chipped paint glinting under the lamplight. The house smelled faintly of starch and lemon oil. From the kitchen came the soft murmur of a baseball game on the radio and the rhythmic sound of his mother washing dishes. The Ellison home was ordinary by every measure: white siding, blue shutters, a patch of yard that grew wild in summer. But it had a warmth that made it feel like the center of something larger. The world outside could roar with headlines and wars and modern inventions, but here, time moved gently, like the slow creak of a porch swing. Tommy looked up at the clock and sighed. The hands crawled toward 8:30. His mother always said that was the latest a boy ought to be awake, even in summertime. Then came the sound he'd been waiting for, the squeak of bicycle wheels outside. Danny Miller came barreling down the sidewalk on his red Schwinn, his blonde hair glinting in the streetlight. "Tommy, you coming out or what?" Tommy jumped up, pressing his nose to the window. His friend stood on the curb, one foot on the pedal, the other tapping restlessly. "I'll be mad," Tommy whispered through the screen. "She won't even know. Come on, just to the corner and back." The sound of the radio rose in the kitchen. His father was arguing with the announcer again about the Fairview Hawks' losing streak. Tommy glanced toward the doorway. Then he slipped his shoes on and crept outside, closing the door softly behind him. The night air was cool and carried the sweet metallic scent of the asphalt that had baked in the sun all day. Fireflies blinked lazily over Mrs. Harper's flower beds. The two boys ran down the sidewalk, Danny pushing his bike beside him, their laughter echoing off the quiet houses. At the end of the street, they stopped beneath the tall lamppost that marked the edge of town. Beyond it stretched the old field full of whispering weeds and the hum of cicadas. Farther still rose the silhouette of the water tower with the fading words, "Welcome to Fairview." Danny pointed toward the horizon. "My pa says they're going to build a gas station there next year." Tommy frowned. "Why? We already got one on Main Street." Danny shrugged. "Pa says the town's growing." Tommy didn't like the sound of that. Growing meant change, and change felt like something you couldn't get back once it started moving. They stood there for a long while, watching the fireflies drift like tiny lanterns in the grass. When they finally turned back, the street looked different somehow. Smaller, quieter, as though it had been holding its breath while they were gone. Sunday mornings on Maple Street were an event of their own. The church bells began tolling at 9, and before the last note faded, front doors opened all down the street. Men in pressed shirts and shining shoes led their families to the old white chapel. Women carried casserole dishes wrapped in clean towels. Children, tugging at collars and ribbons, kicked pebbles along the sidewalk. Tommy and his parents sat 3 pews from the front. His mother sang in a clear, soft voice. His father coughed once or twice and pretended to read the hymnal. Tommy's gaze, however, was fixed on the sunlight spilling through the stained glass, coloring the wooden floor with patches of green and gold. After church, everyone gathered outside by the elm trees. Mrs. Harper handed Tommy a piece of licorice from her handbag. "Keep the light in your window burning, dear," she told him. "That's how the angels find their way home." He didn't understand what she meant, but he nodded solemnly. At home, the house filled with the smell of lemon pie cooling on the windowsill. His mother hummed an old tune, one she said came from her girlhood on a wheat farm near Tulsa. His father sat in the parlor, the Sunday paper open on his lap, the news of faraway places unread but important enough to hold. Tommy thought of Mrs. Harper's words again that evening as he lay in bed, staring at the soft glow leaking through the crack under his door. Somewhere below, the window light was still on, and for a reason he couldn't name, That simple glow made him feel safe. Late that summer, the first big storm rolled in from the west. The clouds came fast and black, swallowing the sun by afternoon. Tommy and Danny watched from the porch, counting the seconds between the lightning and thunder. 3, Danny said. That means it's close. The rain broke suddenly, fierce and heavy. The boys ran inside, soaked to the bone. Mrs. Ellison wrapped them both in towels and set them by the fire. But outside, the wind howled down Maple Street like a thing alive. Branches snapped. A shutter flew loose on the Miller house. The streetlights flickered and went dark. For the first time since Tommy could remember, the window light at number 14 went out too. He felt an odd panic rise in his chest, irrational but sharp. The house, his whole small world, looked different in the dark, as if something sacred had been blown away with the storm. When the power finally returned hours later, his mother relit the lamp. The yellow glow spread once more across the street, touching the puddles, the fences, the drenched flowers. Tommy pressed his hand to the window pane, whispering to himself as though he were swearing an oath, "Don't ever go out again." By the time Tommy turned 12, Maple Street had changed in small but certain ways. A new diner opened near the post office. The old hardware store had a neon sign now that buzzed faintly in the evenings. Cars rolled by more often, sleek, gleaming shapes that looked faster than anything his father would ever buy. Yet every summer, the county fair returned to the same dusty field beyond the water tower, and for one golden week the town felt young again. Tommy and Danny spent their afternoons there, pockets full of marbles and nickels, chasing the scent of popcorn and fried dough. The Ferris wheel turned slow and graceful above the fairgrounds, its colored bulbs flickering against the dusk. It was there that Tommy met Clara Bennett, a girl from the next street over, her hair tied with a yellow ribbon. She was selling lemonade with her mother and laughing at something one of the boys had said. Danny nudged him. "You're staring." "I'm not." "You are." But Tommy didn't move. There was something about the sound of her laughter, light and certain, that made the rest of the fair fade to a blur. Later that night, when the fireworks began, he found himself standing near her again. The first rocket streaked upward, bursting into 1,000 red sparks. For a heartbeat, he looked away from the sky and saw her face lit by the reflection. He would remember that image for the rest of his life. The color, the noise, the wonder of it, and how for the first time he felt the strange pull of a world wider than Maple Street. Autumn came early that year. The air sharpened and the elm leaves turned copper and gold. Tommy began high school. Danny took a part-time job at the mechanic's shop, and Clara moved to a different part of town. The days grew quieter. After school, Tommy sometimes wandered to the old field where they'd once caught fireflies, now fenced off for construction. The sound of hammers echoed where tall grass used to sway. One evening, as he sat on the curb tossing pebbles, Mrs. Harper crossed the street with a small envelope in her hand. "This came for your mother," she said, "but I think it's for you." The envelope was old-fashioned, cream-colored with neat cursive handwriting. Inside was a short note on folded paper. "Dear Tommy, you forgot your handkerchief at the fair. Mama said I should return it, but I thought maybe you'd like to keep it as a souvenir instead." Clara, a small pressed flower, dried and fragile, fell out from the fold. He held it carefully between his fingers. That night, he placed the note inside a cigar box under his bed, beside a few marbles and a brass button from his father's coat. The collection meant nothing to anyone else, but to Tommy, it was proof that the days he loved had been real. The winter that followed was harsh and endless. Snow buried the hedges and lined the roofs like icing. The town seemed muffled, hushed, as if even the wind were too tired to blow. Tommy's father began coughing more often, though he said it was just the cold. His mother kept the kettle whistling all day. At night, Tommy sat by the living room window, watching the flakes fall through the lamplight. The house was smaller without the sound of laughter, the old radio now silent. One evening, he heard the soft creak of the porch steps. Mrs. Harper stood outside, wrapped in her heavy shawl. "Your light's still on," she said, when he opened the door. "That's a good sign." He smiled faintly. Ma says it's the only one that won't burn out. Mrs. Harper nodded. Then keep it that way, Tommy. A home should always have one light waiting. After she left, he stared at the lamp, its glow reflected in the window. He didn't know why, but her words felt important, like something he'd need to remember for later. When spring finally broke, it did so suddenly. The snow melted in a rush, filling the gutters with muddy streams. Children played baseball again in the street. The world seemed to breathe after holding itself too long. But Maple Street was changing faster now. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. Danny talked of enlisting in the Navy once he was old enough. And one morning, a for sale sign appeared in front of Mrs. Harper's house. Tommy stood on the curb staring at it. The red letters looked wrong against the peeling white porch. When she left a month later, she hugged him tightly. "Remember what I told you," she said. "Keep your light burning." Her house sat empty all summer, the curtains drawn. Sometimes Tommy imagined her ghost still watering the geraniums at dusk. On the last Sunday before his 15th birthday, Tommy took his father's old bicycle and rode through town. The air smelled of lilacs again, just like the night years ago when he'd raced Danny to the corner. He passed the diner, the church, the fairground now stripped bare, everything familiar yet changed, as if someone had redrawn the outlines of his world in softer pencil. When he reached the end of Maple Street, he stopped under the lamppost. The sky was violet again, the same shade as that night of fireflies. But Danny had moved away for work. Clara had stopped writing, and Mrs. Harper's window stayed dark. Only one light remained, the soft golden glow from his own house down the block. Tommy watched it flicker faintly through the trees, steady and small like a promise the world had forgotten but one heart still kept. That night, he lay in bed listening to the distant whistle of a train. The sound faded into the dark, and for the first time, he felt something stirring inside, a mix of longing and fear. He didn't know yet that childhood was something you only recognized when it was gone. Downstairs, his mother turned off the radio and checked the window locks. His father coughed once in his sleep. Then just before she went upstairs, she paused at the parlor lamp and let her hand rest on the switch. For a long moment she looked at the glowing light, as though deciding whether to leave it on. Then she smiled faintly and walked away, letting it burn through the night. Outside, Maple Street lay quiet, bathed in the gentle gold of that single window, the light that would one day live on in memory. Long after the house was gone, and somewhere in his dreaming mind, Tommy Ellison promised himself that no matter where life carried him, he'd always remember this: the glow of home, the scent of summer rain, and the window with the light still on. By the summer of 1961, Maple Street had begun to hum with new sounds: the buzz of distant car engines, the bark of radios tuned to rock and roll, and the low, steady drone of the changing world. The elm trees still stood like sentinels, but the children who once played under them had grown taller, quieter, and more aware of time's unspoken weight. Tommy Ellison was 14 now, lanky and restless, his childhood fort behind the garage long since fallen apart. The wooden crates that once held imaginary adventures had turned gray and brittle. But sometimes, when the evening light fell a certain way, he could almost hear the echoes of laughter, the ghosts of his younger self and Charlie and Maggie. He didn't like to admit it, but he missed those simpler days, when every problem could be solved with a flashlight and a promise. Most nights after supper, Tommy would sit on the roof of the garage with a small transistor radio his father had given him for his 13th birthday. The metal casing was scratched, the dial finicky, but when the signal was right, it brought the whole world to Maple Street. He'd lie back on the shingles, tune the radio to WLS Chicago, and let the music pour through the static. Elvis, Sam Cooke, Buddy Holly. Sometimes Maggie would climb up and join him, her dress catching the light of the stars, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "What do you think's out there now?" she'd ask, just like she had years ago. Tommy smiled. "Maybe just people like us, but with better radios." She laughed softly, resting her chin on her knees. The sound blended with the song floating through the air, "Only You" by the Platters. "Maybe we'll leave someday," she said. "Go see all the places these songs come from." "Yeah," Tommy said, not looking at her. "Someday." But he didn't mean we'll leave, he meant you will. He'd seen the way Maggie's eyes followed the buses that passed through town, She was already looking beyond Maple Street, dreaming of something wider, brighter. Tommy, though, he was still rooted here, bound to the rhythms of this quiet street, to the house with the window that never went dark. Jack still worked at the rail yard, though the years had settled heavier on him. The black grease never seemed to wash completely from his hands anymore, and the cough that had started last winter hadn't gone away. He didn't say much about it. He just kept working, kept lighting that window every night. Sometimes Tommy would come home from school and find his father sitting in his old chair, staring at the light the way one might look at a photograph. "You know," Jack said one evening, "your mother loved that window. She said it made the house feel alive." Tommy nodded, watching the flame tremble. "She was right," Jack said. "Some things don't die if you keep them lit." After that, Tommy made a habit of checking the lamp every night before bed. Even when he and Maggie sat on the roof till midnight, he'd sneak back down, peek through the curtains, and make sure the light was still glowing. It wasn't just a habit. It was a promise. By 16, Tommy had found work at the local hardware store, sweeping floors, stacking paint cans, and saving what little money he could. Maple Street wasn't rich in opportunities, but there was pride in small work, and Jack taught him that pride mattered. Saturday nights, though, belonged to youth. The diner at the edge of town became the gathering place. Chrome stools, neon lights, and milkshakes that cost 20 cents. Tommy and Maggie sat there often, listening to the jukebox while others danced. She'd started talking about college, maybe journalism, maybe teaching. Her father had found work again, and the Turners were planning to move closer to the city. Tommy pretended to be happy for her. "That's great," he'd say, forcing a grin. "You'll do amazing." But something inside him twisted. The same feeling you get watching the last firework fade into the sky. The night before she left, they sat again on the garage roof. The radio crackled between them, the stars hidden behind a thin veil of clouds. "Promise me something," Maggie said quietly. "Anything. Don't let this place make you small." Tommy didn't answer right away. The street below was still, a cat crossing the pavement, a porch light flickering. "I won't," he said finally. "But you'll come back, right?" She smiled, that same smile from the summer of the fort. "I'll try." He watched her walk away the next morning, suitcase in hand, her figure fading down the street until she turned the corner and was gone. And for the first time, the window in the Ellison house stayed dark for a moment longer than usual, as if even it couldn't bear to watch her leave. Autumn came, and with it, the first letter. Maggie wrote from college in St. Louis. She described the city lights, the noise, the smell of roasted peanuts from street vendors. She said she missed the quiet and asked if the elm trees still leaned over the street the same way. Tommy read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and tucked it under his pillow. More letters followed, each one a window into a world far beyond Maple Street. But as time passed, they came less often. Her handwriting grew more hurried, her words shorter. Jack noticed the change in his son. The way he stared out the window at night. The way he left the radio off more often than not. "You can't chase people through time. Son," he said one evening, his voice gentle, "but you can remember them kindly. That's how you keep them." Tommy nodded, though his throat ached. He didn't want to keep memories, he wanted moments. And then, in the spring of '64, a letter came that wasn't from Maggie. It was from Charlie Brandt, his childhood friend now living in Chicago. Charlie had joined the Navy. He wrote about the world beyond, ships, salt motion. "You wouldn't believe how big the ocean feels," Charlie wrote. "Makes Maple Street look like a toy world." Tommy smiled faintly reading it. Maybe everyone was meant to leave, he thought. Everyone but him. The night Jack died, the radio was playing softly in the background. An old tune from the '40s, the kind his mother loved. Tommy had been working late, and by the time he got home, the lamp had gone out for the first time in years. He found his father in the chair, head tilted slightly, eyes closed, peaceful, as if he'd simply decided to rest. The old lamp sat cold beside him. Tommy stood there for a long time, his heart an ocean of silence. Then with trembling hands he lit the lamp again. The flame flickered weakly, then caught. Outside the wind stirred, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. That night, he carried the radio up to the roof, turned the dial until the static broke into music, and sat beneath the stars, alone but not lonely. He imagined his parents' voices, Maggie's laughter, Charlie's wild letters from the sea. The song playing was Unchained Melody. The sky above him stretched infinite and alive, and for the first time, Tommy realized what his father had meant, that light doesn't die if you keep it lit. He looked toward the Ellison house, the glow of the window warm against the darkness. The years passed like a slow-turning record, soft at the edges, the same song playing beneath the scratches. By the spring of 1972, Tommy Ellison was 30 years old. The boy who once built forts behind the garage now worked as a mechanic in the same town, fixing engines that coughed and sputtered like tired hearts. The Ellison house still stood on Maple Street, its white paint more faded now, the garden overgrown with wildflowers that had found their own way to survive. The window, that window, still glowed most nights, though the lamp was newer, electric now. But the spirit of the old flame lived inside it, as if the light itself remembered. After his father's passing, Tommy had stayed in the house out of both duty and love. He'd repaired the roof, fixed the porch steps, and kept the front yard trimmed. But there was a quietness to the home now that never lifted. He'd thought, once, that he might marry. There had been a girl named Evelyn, a teacher from the next town over, who loved poetry and cinnamon coffee. She'd come over on Sunday afternoons to read aloud while he tinkered with his old radio. "You live like a man waiting for something," she told him once, half smiling. Tommy looked up from his tools. "Maybe I am. For what?" He paused, then shrugged. A letter that stopped coming. Evelyn stayed for a while, but eventually she left. She said she couldn't build a life with someone who still lived half in memory. Tommy didn't blame her. That night he sat by the glowing window again, holding one of Maggie's old letters, the paper thin and yellowing, the ink faded at the edges. She'd stopped writing sometime in the late 60s after moving to San Francisco. Her last letter had spoken of protests, music, and change. "The world's spinning fast, Tommy," she'd written. "Sometimes I miss when it stood still on Maple Street." He never wrote back, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. The years had a way of stealing words that mattered. It was early autumn when Charlie returned. Tommy saw him first through the workshop window. Broad-shouldered, tanned, a little gray at the temples, but still carrying the same spark in his eyes. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 15 years. Charlie grinned. "Still fixing the world one carburetor at a time, huh?" Tommy laughed. "You look like you've seen all of it." "Most of it," Charlie said, settling onto a stool. "Turns out it's big, but not always better." They spent the evening talking, men about the Navy, the cities, the women, the loneliness. When the shop closed, they walked back down Maple Street together. It was quieter now, many of the old neighbors gone. The houses newer but less personal. "Remember when we used to play war out here?" Charlie said, kicking at a pebble. "Yeah," Tommy smiled. "We thought we'd save the world." Charlie nodded. "Guess it saved itself, just not the way we imagined." That night, they sat on the porch drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, listening to the crickets. The glow from the window spilled out onto the steps. "Still keeping that light on," Charlie said softly. "Yeah," Tommy replied. "Can't sleep without it." There was a long silence, comfortable and sad all at once. "You ever hear from Maggie?" Charlie asked finally. Tommy shook his head. "Not in a long time. Maybe she'll come back someday," Charlie said. "People always circle back to where they started." Tommy looked toward the elm trees, their branches silver in the moonlight. "Maybe," he said, but his heart didn't believe it. Years folded over like worn pages. Charlie eventually left again, this time for good, settling somewhere down south with a family and a quiet life. His letters came occasionally, filled with photos of children Tommy would never meet. Tommy, meanwhile, built his life around rhythm, work, supper, the radio, the lamp. He'd sit at his desk in the evenings, writing letters he never mailed, to Maggie, to his parents, sometimes even to himself. "Dear Maggie, the elm trees are still here. They bend a little more each winter, but they're alive. I fixed up the house again. You wouldn't recognize it now, though the window still glows. Some nights I think I see us sitting under it, talking about space and heroes. Maybe that's how memories work. They don't fade. They just learn to live quietly." He'd fold the letters and place them in a wooden box, the same one his father used for spare nails and screws. It was heavy with words that would never find their way. On some nights, when the air was thick with summer heat and the hum of cicadas, Tommy would open the box, unfold a letter, and read it aloud to the empty room. And though he didn't believe in ghosts, he sometimes thought he heard the faint sound of laughter from the old fort, the echo of a girl's voice asking, "What do you think's up there?" It was during the fall of '78 that the photograph arrived. A plain envelope, no return address, just his name scrawled across the front. Inside was a single picture. Maggie standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, wind tossing her hair, her eyes bright but softer now. On the back, in small handwriting, "Still keeping my light on too." Tommy stared at it for a long time, the corners trembling in his hands. He didn't know where she was or if she'd ever write again, but the message was enough. It felt like the world had whispered back after years of silence. He placed the photograph on the shelf beside the old radio. From that day on, when he turned it on at night, the music seemed warmer, like it carried a piece of her across the miles. By the 1980s, the world outside Maple Street had changed almost beyond recognition. The diner had become a convenience store. The rail yard was gone. People now drove to the city for work, and television light replaced lamplight in most homes. But the Ellison house remained a stubborn relic, timeless, patient, glowing. Tommy had grown older but not bitter. He took joy in small rituals, polishing the Ford his father once owned, mowing the lawn every Saturday morning, fixing the hinges that didn't need fixing. He'd become something of a legend to the few neighbors who remained, the man with the glowing window. Children would whisper stories about him, saying the light never went out because it guarded a secret. He liked that. It made the glow feel alive. Sometimes, when he sat on the porch at dusk, he'd see families walking past, young parents, small children chasing fireflies. He'd smile softly, recognizing himself in them, the way they looked at the world as if it would never end. He hoped they were right. It was on a late October evening, when the leaves had turned copper and the air smelled faintly of smoke, that a car pulled up in front of the Ellison house. Tommy looked up from his porch chair, startled by the sound of tires on gravel. The door opened, and for a moment he thought time had folded in on itself, because there she was. Maggie Turner. Older, yes. Lines around her eyes, a few strands of gray in her hair, but unmistakably her. The same voice, the same quiet grace. She smiled as she walked up the steps. "Hi, Tommy." He rose, his heart stumbling between disbelief and joy. "I thought you were gone?" She laughed softly. "Maybe just lost for a while." They sat on the porch until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing. Her years in California, the people she'd met, the book she was writing about small towns and the stories they keep. "I thought about this place a lot," she said. "About you. About that light." He smiled, eyes soft. "It never went out." She looked toward the glowing window. "I know, I could see it from the corner as I drove up. It still feels like home." When she left that night, she kissed his cheek, light as a memory, and promised to visit again soon. Tommy watched her taillights fade down Maple Street, his heart full, fragile, alive. Then he turned back toward the house, the glow spilling across the porch, and whispered to the night, "Welcome home."